Hi everybody, my name is Christopher Collison and this is Chemistry 670 Scientific Writing, and today we're going to talk about how we think of the audience and why the audience matters. We're going to talk about the image that we want to put across when we're writing to our audience, and we're going to also think about the choice of subjects and how we might choose certain characters depending on who the audience is and that image that we want to put forward. So let's take a look at the first part of a rather long lecture this week. So we'll take a look at part one right up next. So a subtitle you're going to see in most of the rest of the lectures that we'll use in the remainder of this course will be clear, concise and compelling. So we'll talk first about how to write in a clear, concise and compelling way, and then we'll go on to think about how we can present a PowerPoint presentation in a clear, concise and compelling way, because the main focus of this particular course is really how we can communicate our science. So in the last lecture we talked about the character scale. We talked about making sure we put specific actions right into verbs and that we remove the temptation for putting nominalizations into our prose. We also talked about the importance of not using vague words. We want to be as clear as possible in our writing style. We also talked about the 8-word test, and we said that readers don't want to retain a lot of information before they get to the main point of the sentence, before they get to the meaningful character, the subject of that sentence, and then, of course, the main verb, the action of the work. So what are we going to talk about today? So this first section is the first part of a longer lecture, and we're going to cover the first couple of bullets in this particular video. So we're going to look about aligning with the audience, the importance of recognizing the audience. We have an audience even when we are writing, of course. We have a readership, and that's important to remember. We're also going to talk about image, the image we want to portray, and what we're going to call the expert's trap. Well, what is the expert's trap? Well, we'll have a look at that in the next upcoming slides. So first, let's look at aligning with the audience. So we have to account for our readership. How do we do that? Well, we must first think about who our readers are. So we must match any abstract characters to that reader's knowledge. But of course, we always have to keep front and center the idea that we do have this character scale. It's always going to be easier for a reader to understand what we're saying if we're using characters higher on that character scale. But oftentimes it may not always be possible to use such simple language. So again, when we're considering what language to use and what subjects to use, we have to ask the question as to what image we're trying to convey. So what can we ask? We can ask whether the reader will understand our particular character based on their specialized knowledge. We also must ask what is the main theme that we want to get across. What are we trying to get out of our writing? And when we think about these things, that's how we can determine the answer to the question as to what image we want to convey. We also might want to think about whose point of view we want to dominate the reader's understanding. We might want to think about who or what we want the reader to think of as the responsible actor. So we're going to explore these terms, responsible actor, in the next few slides. So let's take a look. Well, what is the responsible actor? Let's put forward an example. So suppose we want to ask for some money from a funding agency, and we want to claim that we've already made a discovery that we need further funding in order to develop. So maybe our goal initially is to claim that we made that discovery. In that case, we may want to, as much as possible, use a character that's actually high on the character scale. We might want to use the words I or we in order to describe the science that we're trying to get funded. In this case, it may not be about the work as much as it is about the person that will be receiving the funds from our sponsor. So we may want to refer regularly to the fact that it is we who will be completing the experiment in the future. On the other hand, sometimes we may be presenting some work and we're less sure about the outcome, but we're perhaps more interested in the strength of the hypothesis. And sometimes this happens in a seminar. We might want to put forward a good idea that's yet to be tested. And therefore, we actually want to beef up the description of that hypothesis. And so maybe it's the hypothesis, it's the science itself, it's a descriptor of the science that we want to be the responsible actor in the discussion topic. We want for that to be front and center for our readership. And I refer often to a presentation, maybe in a seminar. We recognize here that communication is done well either in the written word or in a seminar. It's always important to write well. As they say, the pen is mightier than the sword, and what we write and the clarity of thinking that goes into what we write often translates then into a seminar or an excellent presentation. I think the two interchangeable. But we're going to be in this particular lecture thinking more about how we write rather than how we present. So I've talked earlier in the presentation about how it's important to convey an image, and in this case we may want to convey the image that we made the discovery, but let's go a little bit further beyond this as we think about image, and let's talk about this expert's trap that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So what is the expert's trap? Let me talk about, for a second, non-geminate electron-hole recombination. So I'm certain that most of you in the audience today do not know what non-geminate electron-hole recombination is. I would like to put it to you that it is actually a familiar character to an OPV expert. Well, hang on a second, what does OPV mean? Well, OPV actually means organic photovoltaics. We'll come to that in a second. You'll note that I'm using an acronym. But the point here is that if I am communicating, if I'm writing to a non-OPV expert, then this particular language is actually going to bring a lot of trouble if I use it as the main subject. As I pointed out, it's also worse if I use acronyms. So it's important not to use acronyms, or at least in the initial part of your writing, to clarify what that acronym means with a full description of the words that give rise to the acronym. We might want to repeat those full words several times with the acronym in brackets just to make sure that we're clarifying and we're making that term familiar to the reader. So, yes, we use the term OPV with someone outside of the field, it's a problem. So the point here is that we have to predict which characters our readers can deal with most easily. So always consider your audience and take care with insider jargon, just like non-geminate electron-hole recombination. There's a time and a place for using this particular language very well. Let's explore that a little bit more. So basically, if we must use certain jargon, all right, when would we use that jargon? Well, in general, if we're going to use some complex and abstract ideas in the subject positions of our paragraph, we certainly don't want to keep shifting between subjects in different sentences. This is going to make things really fuzzy for the reader. So we want to stick to a recurring subject. So maybe we stick to non-geminate recombination as a recurring subject, and the readers will get some kind of familiarity with that term. We're also going to use chaining to help us, and this will come up later in the presentation. Chaining is a way in which we can connect different concepts and different ideas. So we'll think about chaining later on. It may take several uses of a certain subject for the reader to accept its familiarity. So again, we want to recur or stick to a recurring subject over and over again, and that reader will become more comfortable with the terms that you're adding, that jargon that you're adding. Here are the two summaries that you would have seen earlier in the classes. And the first summary here, actually, what I've done, I've underlined and bolded the subjects within this paragraph. And you can see that this was the summary that most people had the most difficulty reading when we did the in-class exercise. So let's look at the subjects for a second. We have work, we have efficiency, we have perovskites. We have perovskites again, and we have this, we have paper, we have one, we have alumina device, spectrum, spiro, omitad, and the spectrum. And what happens here is there's not one single subject that seems to carry us through the paragraph. We might think that the paragraph is actually about these perovskites materials. These are mentioned twice, and indeed most of this paragraph is about those perovskites, but we can see how difficult it is to read because that term is not used over and over again, and it's also not in the point sentence of the paragraph to begin with. So we find this quite difficult. If we also look through at the objects that are stated in this particular summary, and they are underlined, we also don't see much repetition of this material, these perovskites in that object position of the sentences. So pause for a second and have a look at this particular summary again and again, especially as we look at other ideas for improving our writing style within this particular lecture. Let's contrast this for a second with summary 2, which in fact it's written by a second person based on the same paper. It was a review of a paper. In this particular case, the opening subject here is organic photovoltaic devices, and that kind of idea continues through. So if we think of the bolded, underlined subject statements here, organic photovoltaic devices, we also find perovskite solar cells. So solar cell is another word for a photovoltaic device. So we have some repetition in here. What we also find later on in the particular summary is another object. It's not a subject in here, but there's a return and a recurrence of this perovskite solar cells concept, even though it's somewhat jargony, but because of the repetition, we can all agree that this particular summary ends up being a little easier to digest. We also have another statement down here, underlined and italicized, the device's operation, where again we're referring back to this solar cell or this device in here. Cells is also one of the subjects in a later sentence. We also see this word perovskites come up a couple of times. So there seems to be these connections between subjects and objects that recur in this paragraph, and this is why everyone who reads these two summaries will generally prefer the second summary of the two, even though both summaries are actually accurate in their description of the paper. So let's come back again to this idea of what image do we wish to leave our audience. And the illustrations I've provided so far, I hope prompt you to know that you must take some time to recognize when you've put specialized concepts into the subjects of sentences, what effect this is going to have on your readers. You also need to recognize when you're talking to an expert. And we'll talk about that in a second. Of course, for a broad audience, if you know you have a broad audience, then remove all those specialized concepts from the subject position. Doesn't mean you can't add them in later through some chaining, so through some connections, but you want to start by providing the reader with a more concrete character higher in the character scale. Of course, you also want to make sure if you're talking to a broad audience that you don't sound aloof, pretentious, or willfully obscure. So when would you choose to use jargon? When is it appropriate to use jargon? And often we might want to think that when we want to belong to the club or join the tribe, when we're talking or writing to an audience of experts, we want to actually belong to that group. So in that particular case, yes, very much we do want to put specialized concepts into the subject. In this case, we expect that the readers will know what we're talking about. An example here is maybe in an experimental section in a paper, we don't really want to give all the minute details. We may only need to use some higher conceptual ideas, and the reader is going to understand what we're talking about. Generally speaking, when readers expect these, what I would say is tribal characters we'll use if we want to belong to the club. So when readers expect these characters, we want to include them. If we leave them out, of course, then we might actually sound less knowledgeable, and we might also sound like an ignorant outsider who does not understand how these experts see the world. So sometimes we're going to want, as scientists, to belong to the club. All in all, this is not easy. You have to think about the audience. You have to think about what characters you are putting into the subject line of your sentences. Another thing I want to state again, and this is a recurrence of an earlier theme, but stick to a recurring subject in general if you want for that topic to be well understood, if you want for that character to be, let's say, more responsible. So what's the topic of your paragraph, for example? So we want to put central ideas into paragraphs. If we want that central idea to come through the paragraph, then we're going to want to repeat that single character as the subject of many sentences. And we saw this earlier with the use of organic photovoltaics or solar cells. The constant repetition of the word devices or cells indicated that that was indeed the theme of the paragraph. There may be times where we want to demonstrate the complexity of a particular scientific idea, and maybe sometimes several characters are needed for this complexity to be understood in a particular section of your writing. You can use multiple characters in those subjects, but as scientists, we really we have a tough time being understood as it is. We have a tough time with a culture around us that tends not to want to listen to scientists. So we certainly don't want readers to be fuzzy on the details. We want to grab their attention, and this means that we do not want to put a variety of abstractions into the subject. So we want to, if we are indeed using some jargon, let's repeat it through. If we want to include different characters, then we want to connect those characters together. We certainly don't want to have a multitude of different abstract characters that nobody can appreciate. A little bit more on the responsible actors or the memorable character. Let's think about what we want the audience to remember when they walk away after reading your writing. If we want to have one main character, then we can build the narrative around that one main character. That particular character is going to be perceived as more responsible for what happened. So when we choose that main character, and a character could be an idea, by the way, it doesn't need to be a person, but when we've built up that particular responsible actor or that responsible character, then the readers actually build their memory and the details of their memories around that particular character. And this is what you can ask your readers or to remember certain aspects from your writing when you deliberately put a single character in as a more responsible one within your writing. But in general terms, this is a case-by-case decision. Bottom line is, think about what you want to convey, think about who the audience is, and once you know what you want to convey and who that audience is, write an outline. It's most helpful, and then it allows you to set out your paragraphs, and you can follow through to make sure that you have that repeating character within those paragraphs. That's the way in which the audience will remember what you have to say. Well, we're going to move on to connectors in the next video. But for now, remember who your audience is. Think about your audience. Think about the characters that you want your audience to walk away remembering. Okay, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.